The atmospheric control system of the 72nd floor executive penthouse maintained a rigid, unyielding temperature of exactly 68.4 degrees, circulating filtered air that smelled faintly of static electricity and expensive chemical polish. Sprawled across the expansive surface of a custom upholstered charcoal gray leather sectional sofa lay Elias Vance, the chief executive officer, a man whose entire corporate strategy was built upon the architecture of manufactured intimidation. Vance was not resting. He was executing a highly calculated performance of slumber, his chest rising and falling in a forced, rhythmic cadence designed to project total, unbothered dominance over his environment, waiting with predatory stillness for his subordinates to enter and navigate around his fragile, ego-driven test. His eyelids remained shut, though the microscopic tremors in his ocular muscles betrayed the immense, conscious effort required to suppress his natural reactions, his right hand resting artificially upon his abdomen, his pulse elevated not by fatigue, but by the arrogant anticipation of exerting leverage over whoever dared to disturb the silence. Entering this carefully constructed theater of power was Arthur, a 41-year-old facility maintenance technician clad in a standardized, industrial gray uniform that bore the precise fading of 2 years of meticulous daily laundering, projecting a single, straight-line, lean physical build, devoid of unnecessary bulk, creating a striking, consistent vertical silhouette. Arthur pushed a heavy-duty polymer utility cart whose wheels had been perfectly calibrated and lubricated with graphite powder to eliminate even the slightest fractional decibel of friction-induced squeaking. Arthur moved with a structural, undeniable efficiency, his physical actions entirely devoid of wasted kinetic energy, not rushing to complete his tasks, not performing a pantomime of hard work for unseen supervisors, but simply and methodically executing the absolute requirements of environmental sanitation with the quiet grace of a man who understood the fundamental mechanics of the physical world. Seated upon the reinforced lower shelf of the utility cart, her legs dangling exactly 3 inches above the anti-static carpet tiles, was Lily, Arthur's 6-year-old daughter, a profoundly quiet observer, wearing a faded denim jacket and holding a complex spherical puzzle toy that her father had repaired using a scavenged microspring and a localized application of thermal adhesive. Lily did not speak, did not fidget, and did not demand attention. She simply processed the complex, bizarre behavioral patterns of the adults around her with the flat, unblinking, analytical gaze of a child who had learned early that survival in adult spaces required extreme, absolute stillness. Arthur retrieved a microfiber cloth and a spray bottle containing a precisely diluted solution of distilled water and isopropyl alcohol, approaching the massive tempered glass conference table that dominated the center of the room, entirely ignoring the performative stillness of the chief executive officer, lying less than 12 feet away. The janitor applied exact, even pressure to the glass, his hand sweeping in perfect, overlapping concentric arcs that left no chemical residue, no streaks, and no evidence of his presence other than the absolute restoration of the surface's intended transparency. His breathing slow, deep, and genuinely regulated, a stark and profound contrast to the shallow, manufactured respiration of the millionaire, pretending to be asleep on the sofa. Vance heard the subtle, rhythmic sound of the wiping, the microscopic friction of cloth against glass, and he tightened his jaw infinitesimally, infuriated by the absolute lack of hesitation or fear in the maintenance worker's movements, demanding internally that the janitor recognize the gravity of his presence. Yet Arthur simply continued, turning the cloth to a dry section, his focus locked entirely on the physical reality of the task utterly immune to the invisible projected hierarchy of the room. The heavy pressurized door to the adjacent central server infrastructure room slid open with a sudden, violent pneumatic hiss, fracturing the engineered silence of the penthouse and signaling an immediate, catastrophic disruption in the building's operational equilibrium. The ambient auditory profile of the entire floor shifted instantly. The constant low-frequency hum of the 84-terabyte algorithmic trading mainframe ceased entirely, replaced by the terrifying hollow dead air of massive mechanical failure. The air temperature in the room immediately began to rise, shifting upward by exactly zero point 0.4 degrees within seconds as the primary cooling turbines halted their rotational spin. Chief Operations Officer Sarah Jenkins burst through the threshold, her physical momentum carrying her 3 steps into the penthouse before she abruptly froze, her high-heeled shoes digging into the synthetic carpet fibers as she registered the supposedly sleeping form of Elias Vance on the leather sofa. Jenkins was 38 years old, wearing a meticulously tailored $4,000 charcoal suit, but her professional veneer was rapidly dissolving under the extreme physiological stress of witnessing $420 million of stored transactional data dangling over a digital precipice. Her pupils were fully dilated, her capillary network constricting, pulling the color from her cheeks and leaving her face a mask of stark, rigid panic, a microscopic sheen of nervous perspiration instantly forming along her hairline. She knew the unwritten ironclad protocol of the executive floor. Never, under any circumstances, wake the chief executive officer unless the physical structural integrity of the building was compromised. Yet, the absolute cessation of the trading servers represented a financial collapse of unprecedented magnitude. She stood paralyzed in the center of the room, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths, caught between the absolute terror of the silent mainframe and the absolute terror of the man faking sleep on the furniture. Vance heard her enter, heard the distinctive panicked pattern of her respiration, and he consciously, maliciously regulated his own breathing even further, refusing to open his eyes, refusing to offer leadership or guidance, choosing instead to utilize the crisis as a psychological weapon to test her breaking point. He relished the heavy, suffocating weight of her indecision, his arrogant ego feeding entirely on her visible physical manifestation of failure, believing that her inability to act elevated his own untouchable status. Exactly 12 feet away, entirely unaffected by the sudden vacuum of authority, Arthur knelt beside the utility cart, deliberately and methodically wringing out a sponge into a secondary bucket, his motions maintaining the exact same slow burn, rhythmic pacing as before the server collapse. He did not jump at the sudden noise. He did not gasp at the profound silence of the dead servers, and he did not look up at the paralyzed executive. He simply adjusted his grip on the sponge, expelling exactly the necessary volume of liquid, his stoic competence completely untethered from the corporate panic. Lily shifted her weight slightly on the cart, her small hands turning the repaired puzzle toy with quiet clicks, her deadpan, innocent eyes locking onto Jenkins' terrified, sweating face, observing the adult's complete collapse of function with the detached curiosity of a scientist, watching a frantic insect trapped in a jar. A frantic surge of chaotic motion flooded the penthouse as 6 heavily compensated elite structural software engineers sprinted through the pneumatic doors, their arrival shattering the remaining tension with loud, uncoordinated desperation. They were shouting over one another in rapid, disjointed bursts of highly technical jargon, throwing around terms like cascade failure, redundancy bypass, and localized node corruption, using extreme volume as a desperate, transparent substitute for actual understanding and competence. They swarmed the dead mainframe unit in the adjacent room, their fingers slamming against emergency diagnostic keyboards with frantic, wasted kinetic energy, their panicked actions entirely devoid of any methodical diagnostic logic. They argued vehemently, not debating the actual mechanical truth of the failure, but aggressively posturing to ensure that the inevitable blame would deflect away from their specific departments, their voices echoing harshly against the tempered glass and polished steel of the executive suite. Vance remained perfectly still on the sofa, listening to the absolute chaos unfolding just beyond the open doorway, a microscopic, deeply arrogant smirk playing at the very edge of his lips as he absorbed their total operational failure. He viewed their terror as a vindication of his own supreme importance, entirely willing to let the multi-million-dollar system burn if it meant he could stand over its ashes and ruthlessly fire them all for their incompetence. The lead engineer, a man whose tailored shirt was now thoroughly soaked with fear-induced sweat, furiously typed a command sequence that resulted only in a massive, glaring red error code flashing across the primary monitor. Error 704, a structural notification that none of the 6 experts knew how to interpret or bypass. The room began to smell faintly but distinctly of hot ozone, melting synthetic wire casing, and the sharp, sour tang of human adrenaline, the environmental conditions rapidly deteriorating as the stagnant heat from the massive processors radiated outward. Arthur stood up smoothly, lifting a heavy-duty mop from the cart, his posture perfectly vertical, his expression an absolute, unreadable mask of calm, observing the frantic engineers not with pity or amusement, but with the cold, detached recognition of professional inadequacy. He pressed the mop head against the floor, engaging the fibers with exact, measured force, pushing the implement forward in a straight, uncompromising line, entirely ignoring the screaming millionaires arguing just feet away from him. Lily ceased turning her puzzle toy, pointing a small, steady finger toward the frantic group of adults, her voice cutting through the noise with devastating deadpan clarity. "They are sweating from their faces, but their hands do not know what to do," she stated, her simple, undeniable observation floating over the chaos, highlighting the profound absurdity of their performative panic. The engineers were too consumed by their own terror to register the child's absolute truth, but Arthur paused his forward motion, the mop handle locked at exactly a 15-degree angle in his grip, his eyes slowly shifting from the floor to the massive, silent metal chassis of the dying server. Arthur did not look at the frantic flashing lights of the monitors, nor did he listen to the chaotic, overlapping software theories being shouted by the engineers. He looked exclusively and intensely at the physical architecture of the mainframe. 8 years prior, Arthur had not worn industrial gray. He had worn the sterile, anti-static white suit of a Tier 1 structural hardware architect, sitting in the very clean room where the thermal dispersion matrix for this exact generation of data processors had been conceptualized and drafted. He knew the internal geography of the massive machine with absolute granular intimacy, having personally calculated the fluid dynamics of the cooling loops, having personally warned the previous board of directors about a catastrophic structural vulnerability involving microscopic stress fractures in the tertiary brass mounting brackets. He had been aggressively silenced, pushed out of his role during a hostile corporate acquisition orchestrated by Vance, his warnings buried under a mountain of profit margin demands, leaving him stripped of his professional status and utterly destitute following the sudden, devastating medical crisis that had claimed his wife. He had taken the maintenance position in the very building he helped engineer because it offered immediate, unquestionable medical benefits for Lily, swallowing his pride not out of defeat, but out of a profound, stoic dedication to his daughter's survival. He carried no loud, performative resentment in his chest. He carried only cold, absolute, undeniable knowledge of exactly how the physical world operated, understanding this machine far better than the frantic men who currently owned it. He analyzed the silence of the server, instantly correlating the lack of specific turbine vibration with the exact trajectory of the rising ambient heat, calculating the internal pressure variance in his head within a span of 4 seconds. He knew with absolute certainty that this was not a Cascade software failure, nor a localized node corruption, but a purely physical mechanical blockage in the tertiary coolant loop, a physical throttle that had triggered an automatic hardwired thermal shutdown to prevent a catastrophic melting of the silicon core. He visualized the exact location of the jammed valve, buried deep behind the heavy steel casing, knowing that no amount of frantic keyboard typing could turn a physical wrench or realign a physical bracket. He did not ask for permission, he did not seek validation, and he did not hesitate. He leaned his mop handle against the wall with perfect balance, ensuring it would not fall, and turned his body entirely toward the crisis, his demeanor shifting from passive maintenance to active, unyielding structural intervention. Arthur stepped forward, his heavy rubber-soled boots making absolutely no sound against the floor, his physical presence moving through the chaotic, shouting engineers like a solid, undeniable force cutting through stagnant air. Because the engineers were relying entirely on extreme volume and frantic motion, they did not register the quiet, methodical approach of the maintenance technician until he was already standing directly in front of the primary server rack. Jenkins noticed him, her panic instantly morphing into defensive, hierarchical outrage as she stepped directly into his path, her arm extending in a sharp, prohibitive gesture designed to reassert her crumbling authority. She commanded him to step back, to remove himself from the restricted area, utilizing a harsh, dismissive tone specifically engineered to force subordinates into immediate, unquestioning compliance. Arthur did not shrink, he did not step back, and he did not offer a subservient apology. He simply stopped his forward momentum, locking his steady, observant eyes directly onto her dilated, terrified pupils. His expression contained absolutely zero submission, projecting instead a quiet, terrifyingly grounded authority that completely neutralized her aggressive posture. He spoke in a low, resonant, deeply factual voice, stating that if the tertiary cooling loop was not manually vented within exactly 4 minutes and 20 seconds, the localized heat buildup would fundamentally alter the physical structure of the central processing unit, resulting in a permanent, unrecoverable loss of $420 million of stored algorithmic data. He did not yell, he did not inflect his sentence with emotion, and he did not wait for her to process the catastrophic reality of his statement. He simply delivered the undeniable structural truth with the cold precision of a falling axe. Jenkins froze instantly, the extreme granular specificity of his technical diagnosis completely paralyzing her brain, her arm dropping slowly to her side as the frantic engineers behind her simultaneously ceased their typing, the room suddenly plunging into a heavy, suffocating silence. The power dynamic of the entire penthouse shifted in a fraction of a second, transferring entirely away from the wealthy, panicked executives and settling squarely onto the broad, stoic shoulders of the man in the gray uniform. From her position on the utility cart, Lily kicked her legs in a slow, rhythmic pattern, her voice echoing clearly in the newly silent room. "My dad actually fixes broken things," she stated, looking directly at the frozen chief operations officer. "You're just pressing plastic buttons and hoping." Arthur entirely bypassed the paralyzed executive, closing the final distance to the massive, towering metal casing of the mainframe without a single wasted movement. He completely ignored the glaring red warning screens and the blinking, frantic LED arrays, dropping to one knee with smooth, calculated precision, positioning his body directly in front of the lowest, most inaccessible ventilation panel. He reached into the deep right pocket of his standardized gray uniform, his hand bypassing the expected janitorial supplies, and extracted a simple, heavily worn flathead implement that he had meticulously fashioned from a piece of hardened industrial steel to repair the specialized chain on Lily's bicycle. He did not deploy a sophisticated, multi-thousand-dollar diagnostic scanner. He simply inserted the cold steel implement into a nearly invisible microscopic seam at the very base of the heavy server casing. He applied exactly 40 pounds of targeted rotational pressure to the implement, feeling the internal locking mechanism through the vibration of the metal, waiting for the precise mechanical click that confirmed the release of the primary seal. The heavy steel casing popped outward a fraction of an inch, and Arthur smoothly slid the massive protective panel away, completely exposing the dense, dangerously hot, complex wiring and internal architecture of the multi-million-dollar machine. The engineers standing behind him gasped in unison, an involuntary sound of horror, knowing that physically breaking the seal on that casing instantly voided every massive warranty and violated every strict operational protocol the company possessed. Arthur ignored their collective shock, reaching his bare hand directly into the dense, radiating heat of the machine's internal cavity, entirely unbothered by the rising temperature. He was not searching, he was not guessing, and his fingers did not fumble. He navigated the dark, cramped space with the absolute physical memory of a creator returning to his design. His fingertips located the specific brass release valve of the tertiary coolant loop, feeling the intense, unnatural pressure building behind the jammed mechanism, confirming his immediate diagnosis of a physical misalignment caused by a loose, secondary locking nut. He grasped the valve, sliding the flathead implement into the narrow locking groove, his movements entirely devoid of the frantic, sweating energy of the engineers. He was not rushing. He was not performing calm for an audience. He was simply applying pure, undeniable mechanical truth to a fundamental mechanical problem, his focus absolute and unbroken. On the leather sofa across the room, Elias Vance was losing the physical ability to maintain his elaborate performance of sleep, his internal heart rate skyrocketing as the narrative of the room violently escaped his control. The sudden heavy silence, followed immediately by the terrifying metallic click of the mainframe casing being manually breached, completely contradicted his expected outcome of the crisis, shattering his arrogant assumption that his staff would simply beg him for intervention. He opened his right eye infinitesimally, allowing a tiny sliver of light to enter his vision, and saw the broad back of the maintenance worker kneeling inside the exposed, hyper-expensive hardware of his most critical asset. Real, unfiltered panic spiked sharply in his chest, a desperate, clawing need to yell, to assert immediate dominance, to physically rip the janitor away from the machine, but doing so would instantly destroy his entire facade of unbothered sleeping power. He was completely trapped within his own performative arrogance, forced to lie silently while a man in a gray uniform dictated the survival of his company. Arthur turned the implement, applying exactly 20 pounds of counter-rotational torque to the jammed brass valve. A sharp, violent, incredibly loud hiss of escaping, hyper-pressurized air immediately filled the room, the sound dominant and cutting, completely overpowering the frantic breathing of the executives. A microscopic cloud of sudden condensation formed in the air as the supercooled liquid equalized, wrapping around Arthur's steady hand. He held his grip absolutely rigid, counting the release of pressure in his head, waiting exactly 12 seconds for the internal fluid dynamics to stabilize before engaging the valve again. He then utilized the implement to reach deeper into the casing, locating the loose secondary locking nut that the original assembly team had failed to secure, the exact flaw he had warned the board about 96 months prior, and tightened it with brutal, permanent finality. The mechanical action was complete, undeniable, and permanent. The structural vulnerability was erased not by a software patch, but by the quiet, expert application of physical force. Arthur slowly withdrew his hand from the machine, retrieving a corner of his microfiber cloth to deliberately and carefully wipe a single drop of condensation from the polished metal edge of the chassis. The massive server responded instantly to the physical correction, emitting a low, ascending, powerful frequency as the massive cooling turbines roared back into synchronized rotational life, vibrating the floorboards with their renewed energy. The diagnostic monitors, previously locked in a blinding, flashing state of red error codes, flickered twice before resetting to a steady, calm, operational blue, the data streams resuming their rapid, uninterrupted flow across the screens. The absolute catastrophic crisis was entirely averted, having taken exactly 3 minutes and 40 seconds from the moment Arthur had leaned his mop handle against the wall to the moment the turbines re-engaged. The 6 elite engineers stared blankly at the calm blue screens, then slowly turned their heads to stare at the kneeling man in the gray uniform, their brains completely incapable of comprehending the massive juxtaposition of his menial attire and his absolute god-level technical capability. Jenkins stepped closer to the open machine, her eyes dropping away from Arthur to look at the exposed internal chassis, spotting something engraved deeply into the metal near the repaired valve. It was a microscopic, highly precise structural signature etched into the brass, an A intertwined with a complex geometric helix, the undeniable permanent mark of the system's original chief architect. She looked slowly back up at Arthur's stoic, unreadable face, the realization of his true identity hitting her like a physical blow to the chest, the unspoken truth settling heavily over the executives and crushing the last remnants of their arrogance. Vance could no longer endure the suffocating weight of his irrelevance, recognizing that the crisis had been solved without his input, without his permission, and without his manufactured fear. He sat up violently on the sofa, stretching his arms wide and feigning a deep theatrical yawn, attempting to instantly reclaim the center of attention and project massive, unbothered authority. He stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from his bespoke suit, clapping his hands together in a slow, incredibly patronizing rhythm that echoed sharply across the room. He loudly announced to the frozen room that he had been entirely awake the entire time, testing their responses under extreme pressure, and declared that every single engineer had failed his test miserably, while dismissively claiming that the maintenance man had simply gotten extraordinarily lucky by hitting the right pipe. Vance aggressively closed the distance across the room, projecting loud, unearned confidence as he marched toward Arthur, deliberately occupying physical space with the swagger of a man who believed money could alter reality. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit, withdrawing a heavy, solid gold money clip, and extracted a single, crisp, perfectly flat $100 bill. He extended his arm, holding the petty currency out toward the man who had just saved his entire empire, his voice dripping with condescension as he told Arthur to take his kid out for a nice dinner, casually referring to the stoic expert as Buddy. Vance was actively attempting to rewrite the narrative of the last 4 minutes, desperately trying to reduce a multi-million-dollar Tier 1 structural rescue into a menial, lucky favor that could be dismissed with a tiny fraction of wealth. Arthur did not raise his hand to accept the money, Nor did he break his perfectly calm, perfectly vertical posture. He simply stared directly into Vance's eyes, his expression utterly devoid of intimidation, respect, or anger. The ambient noise of the humming servers seemed to fade into the background as the room fell into a tense, agonizingly heavy silence, every eye locked on the confrontation between extreme wealth and absolute competence. Arthur spoke, his voice resembling the low, grinding sound of heavy stone moving over stone, projecting undeniable historical fact. He stated with extreme precision that the thermal throttle was caused specifically by a vibrating manifold lock on the tertiary loop, a fundamental design flaw explicitly detailed in Structural Report 7-A, a report that Vance had personally vetoed to save exactly $82,000 in manufacturing costs during the acquisition, directly causing today's near-total collapse. The extreme granular accuracy of the statement hit Vance with physical force, draining the color entirely from his face as his arrogant narrative was systematically dismantled by undeniable, recorded history. He stood completely frozen, his arm still extended with the useless currency, unable to form a coherent response to the absolute truth of his own catastrophic mismanagement. Lily tilted her head, observing the paralyzed millionaire with profound, simple curiosity, her small voice cutting perfectly through the silence. "Why are you pretending you were asleep when you are so scared?" she asked, her tone entirely flat. "Your eyelids were shaking the whole time, and only little babies fake sleep when they know they are in big trouble." The devastating, unvarnished finality of the young child's observation shattered the absolute last remaining shred of Vance's projected authority, exposing the pathetic, performative core of his leadership to every executive in the room. He possessed absolutely no technical defense against Arthur's structural facts, and his fragile, manufactured ego had just been effortlessly dismantled by the simple, undeniable logic of a 6-year-old girl. He remained locked in place, his jaw trembling slightly, his hand still foolishly holding the $100 bill in the open air. Utterly powerless in his own penthouse, Jenkins moved with sudden, decisive purpose, stepping forward and physically placing her body between Vance and Arthur, a deliberate, undeniable geographic rejection of Vance's leadership, and a clear alignment with pure competence. She looked directly at Arthur, pointedly ignoring Vance, and addressed the man in the gray uniform by his proper formal title, acknowledging him aloud as the original chief structural architect of the entire system. She asked, her voice steady and respectful, what the corporation owed him for the successful, immediate execution of an emergency structural intervention. Arthur did not use the moment to demand his old position back. He did not seek a triumphant return to their toxic, ego-driven ecosystem, and he did not smile. He meticulously lifted the heavy steel server casing, sliding it perfectly back into place until the microscopic locks clicked, securing the hardware before wiping his fabricated steel implement entirely clean and returning it to his pocket. He stated, looking only at Jenkins, that his standard fee for an emergency, out-of-contract, Tier 1 structural engineering consultation was exactly $14,500, and that the sum was to be wired immediately, down to the exact cent, into his daughter's established trust account. He did not wait for a handshake, a confirmation, or an apology. He simply turned around, grasping the cold metal handle of his utility mop and resting it securely on his cart. "Come on, Lily," he said, his voice dropping back to its quiet, gentle tone, devoid of any corporate, aggressive energy. "We still have the entire 73rd floor to finish." They rolled the cart smoothly out of the room, the perfectly lubricated wheels making absolutely no sound, leaving the frozen, wealthy executives standing utterly silent in the perfect, rhythmic, undeniable hum of absolute defeat.